Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. I'm here today at Morphy's with the FNC that I've done a couple of videos on recently. We did one on the tabletop talking about its history and how it works, took it out to the range, did some shooting, and those are all well and good, but there's still one question left about the FNC that I think ought to be addressed, and that is the question of why are there so many FNC auto sears registered in the United States? The commonly held understanding is that there are in fact more registered FNC auto sears than there are FNCs in the United States. And that's a very odd situation. Like, why? How did that come to be, and why on earth would that be the case? Why the FNC? So a little bit of legal context here. Until 1986, it was perfectly legal to manufacture a new machine gun in the United States. You would fill out the Form 1 from ATF, you would send it to them along with their $200 tax stamp. If you were a licensed manufacturer, you didn't have to send them the $200, but you didn't have to be a licensed manufacturer to manufacture a machine gun. You could make one for yourself if you wanted. And any gun thus registered would be fully transferable, as long as a person wasn't a felon, wasn't prohibited from possessing firearms in general, they can own a machine gun. That is the definition of a transferable machine gun. And anything made in the United States before 1986 was fully transferable. So there were, in the ramp up to like the final period, short period, a year or so before the registry was closed in 1986, there was a lot of manufacture, actually less than the year before. As once people discovered that the registry was going to close, there was a massive surge in manufacture and registration of new machine guns in the US. And that took many forms. You saw Mac-style submachine gun frames being stamped out and bent basically to the minimum requirements to be considered complete receivers by ATF and registered. You saw Sten machine gun tubes, just piece of tube, stamp a number on it, register it, because the registry was going to close and you could register everything you wanted right up until that last day. And people recognized that if I'm in this business, or frankly, if I want to make a whole bunch of money, I can create a bunch of the stuff now and then the supply will be cut off and I'm basically guaranteed that the value of these things will go up. Now, in addition to making complete machine guns, there was also a rush to manufacture auto sears. And some of these we see as drop-in auto sears or lightning links for AR pattern guns. But there are also some where there are essentially converted trigger mechanisms to take a semi-auto and turn it into full auto, and they're typically called auto sears. That's just the term people are referring to. The one added part that you are adding into the system is an auto sear, which essentially is a mechanical addition to the trigger mechanism. Like having a trigger mechanism where as long as you hold down the trigger, the hammer of the gun will just fly back and forth, that's pretty easy. The problem is that doesn't work reliably and safely in a real firearm, because what will happen is the hammer will follow the bolt forward as the bolt goes forward and potentially fire it out of battery or not have enough energy to strike the firing pin hard enough to detonate a primer. So instead what you get is an auto sear or an auto trip, which basically holds the hammer back itself. There's a regular sear that holds the hammer back till you pull the trigger. There's an auto sear that also holds the hammer back until the bolt's fully in battery. Then it trips, hence auto trip, trips that sear, releases the hammer, and then fires. It's both a safety mechanism and a reliability mechanism for a machine gun. And there are a couple of patterns of guns where we have a lot of auto sears on the market. The most common, the most recognizable one would be H&K. And this is partly because HK used essentially the exact same trigger pack for a whole bunch of different models of gun. And here's a relevant point. On an HK, the registered component was the upper stamped sheet metal receiver. The grip and the fire control mechanism within it were not regulated, messed with parts. So you could take a lower grip assembly that's not a gun by itself, it's not regulated as anything, convert it into a machine gun, register it as a machine gun, and then someone can buy that and put it onto whatever HK they want. That was, by the way, that's the original setup. That's not quite how it still works. There were a couple of different companies that were manufacturing auto sears, registering them right up until the last possible moment before the Hughes Amendment closed the machine gun registry. One of those companies was S&H, and they made predominantly HK Sears. And they made a lot of them. And someone happened to mention to the owner that, we can do this with some other guns too. In particular, we can do it with FNCs. Now, the thing that makes the HK and the FNC special, aside from other guns, for example, why didn't people do this quite so much with AR-15s? Well, the answer is the AR-15 lower receiver is the registered regulated component. Take all the parts off the gun, the lower receiver is by itself a firearm. And the lower receiver is the part that has to be modified to hold an auto sear, in the case of an AR-15. If you take an AR lower, you have to actually register that complete lower as a machine gun. And again, you can't do this anymore, but pre-86. Which meant that if you're going to make an auto sear for the AR, you have to actually have the receiver do the modifications, put it in, and all that. And there's overhead in doing that. With HK, the registered part of the gun, or the regulated part, it wasn't registered, the part that's considered a firearm is the upper receiver. The trigger housing that held the parts that you would have to change to put an auto sear in was not a firearm. So you could get that, manufacture that into legally a machine gun, and you don't have to have this big inventory of guns mated to your auto sears. You can just sell an auto sear, someone else can go clip it onto a gun, because the auto sear is registered, the gun doesn't need to be. I'm going to avoid some of the really technical end of the details here in order to stick to our story, which is why are there so many FNC sears? Well, the FNC is like the HK, and it's a little bit odd because mechanically speaking, this is very similar to an AR-15. The lower is held on with a pair of push pins, and you can pull it off, and the whole fire control group's in there. And from a fundamental, how the gun's set up, it's essentially the same as an AR. But the upper is considered the legal firearm part, not the lower. So you could take an FNC and drill and modify the lower to put an auto sear in it without turning a gun into a machine gun. So you didn't have to have the FNCs in stock. Essentially what this means is S&H was able to make this little tiny stupid lever that costs about a nickel to actually manufacture, register that, and then when you bought one from them, what they'd say is, okay, send us your FNC, and we'll make the necessary modifications, install our auto sear, and send it back to you. Transfer ownership when we send the whole gun back. And it was a very low overhead sort of thing. And S&H got the idea, like they've been making HK sears, and they decide, oh, hey, we could do this for FNCs as well. And there are a couple thousand FNCs in the country. And the owner kind of went overboard a little bit, didn't really care how many FNCs there actually were. They just got into production, and the things, once they're in production, the things are really so easy to manufacture and cheap to manufacture that they just cranked out as many as they possibly could before the registry closed. There is nothing necessarily to prevent the same thing from having been done on a different model of firearm. A SIG 550, for example, would work the same way, but there weren't so many of those in the country at the time, and S&H ran out of time. The registry closed before, they didn't have an infinite amount of time or manufacturing resources to make all of the auto sears for all of the models that they potentially could have. The FNC was the one that came to the company's attention, was the one that they tooled up and made, in addition to HK sears, and that's what we ended up with on the market. And yeah, there were a ton of them. S&H had those things in inventory, just call us up and you can buy one. You don't have to try and find it at an auction or find one for secondary sale. They had them in inventory until 2002 or 2003, so almost 20 years after the registry closed. So this has been a bit long-winded. I apologize. Hopefully it came out reasonably understandable, but it's essentially one guy at one company realizing that he can make FNC auto sears and is perfectly happy to have a large stockpile of them to sell for years and decades after the registry closes. That is why we ended up with a ton of FNC auto sears. And as a result, a full auto FNC was really one of the recognized budget machine guns for a very long time. They're not quite anymore because all machine gun prices have come up, but it's still a heck of a lot cheaper to get a full auto FNC than it is a full auto AR-15 or a full auto HK, guns that are a bit more modular and guns that more people are familiar with and want. A second part of this that I know people are going to ask, so it's worth commenting on, there is another gun that is very similar to the FNC in terms of fire control group, and that is the FN SCAR. And there has been a lot of discussion about the fact that an FNC auto sear is extremely similar to an FN SCAR auto sear, and perhaps one can have a full auto transferable registered SCAR by taking a registered FNC auto sear and dropping it into a SCAR. And last I am aware of, ATF had been asked about this. Someone wanted to do it, and ATF came up with a policy decision that they would not allow that an FNC sear could only be installed legally into an FNC gun. In fact, they specifically said a Belgian-made FNC, and that if anyone made a domestic clone here in the US now, those guns would not be legally allowed to have registered FNC auto sears in them. That may or may not be a legally defensible position, but to the best of my knowledge, no one has actually taken it to court because it's not worth anyone's time to try and fight ATF's lawyers in court over that question. So if that were to happen, of course, the value of FNC auto sears would go way up because now they could drop into other guns like FN SCARs, and people would be excited about that. But for the time being, it remains just original Belgian FNCs. Anyway, hopefully this slightly rambling, odd video has been of some interest to you. Thanks for watching.